This is Ryder Richards. Welcome to Let Us Think About It. Today I am interviewing Zackary Sietz. He is a doctoral student at the University of Texas at Denton, UTD, and we're going to be discussing global citizenship. So what does that mean? Well, we cover how to be a global citizen, especially when our globalized society is composed of multinational companies, but and often the world is dominated by them, and nation states seem to be losing power. So, of course, this works for consumers, those making millions and millions of dollars off consumers, but we need to also consider the people who are hurt by these systems, who have been decentered or marginalized. Along the way, we discuss Marxian separation in the processes of labor, intentionally hidden costs for ease and comfort, of course, for our own ease and comfort at the pain of somebody else, and this comes into ethical consumption versus letting poverty exist. We also discuss humans behaving as machines, Charlie Chaplin, racist protocols and surveillance in the classroom, how animals factor into our humanity, and of course, how we should reconsider our systems of power and things like taxation. Now, digging in towards the end, Sietz discusses how flawed standardized testing is really quite antithetical to learning today and somehow takes up 15% of the school year for very questionable and narrow results. So I enjoyed the conversation. I hope you enjoy it as well. Let me know in the comments section what you think. See you at the end. All right, welcome back to Let Us Think About It. This is Ryder Richards. Today I'm interviewing Zach Sietz, a buddy of mine, and we're going to be talking about global citizenship. So, and all that entails. Zach, do you want to introduce yourself for us?
Sure. So I'm Zach Sietz. I am a social studies teacher here in the North Texas area and also a doctoral student at the University of North Texas, studying curriculum instruction with a focus on social studies education. So that's kind of how I have come to understand citizenship and really thinking about what it means to teach citizenship to high schoolers, or just to all students.
Wow. So I would assume to myself that citizenship is just sort of, baked in to the society. So if we're teaching somebody something like what kind of things are you focusing on?
Yeah, that is actually a really interesting question because there's a lot of things about citizenship that we don't even really think about when we're teaching it, and things are baked in, like in this, most state social studies standards will have something in them about teaching students to be good citizens or, sometimes even active citizens. And so thinking, well, first of all, what does it mean to be a good citizen? What does it mean to be an active citizen? But then, like you said, what does it mean to be a citizen? And depending upon who you're asking, who you're talking to, that idea can look very different.
Yeah. I've read something a little while back that most American citizens would fail the citizenship test.
Yeah.
Which I found hysterical.
Right.
And it probably quite true, right? Because we just take these things for granted.
Absolutely. And really, I mean, the idea that you can somehow quantify what it means to be a citizen by asking someone who the 13th president was. I don't know who the 13th president of the United States was off the top of my head. Hopefully
Jason
it wasn't
Myers.
Abraham Lincoln. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that whole notion of we're going to, quantify your knowledge. Like, yes, there's obviously some things that people need to know. For example, when I was in London a few years ago, it helped to know, instead of looking, for cars coming on the right side, to look at the opposite side. And, they had markers on the streets in London to check the other way for people like me who didn't want to do that. So
yeah. So, yeah, and then I guess that's just a set of assumptions that because we grow up a certain way, we think a certain way. And, I mean, when you're trying to teach this, are you sort of redirecting people or just sort of pointing out things that are obvious that they have forgot to consider?
Both. I mean, it honestly, it's very situational. So there are times where we're talking, it's like, hey, what are some issues that you see in your community might be a good, especially for students who are in elementary school whose, lives are generally a lot more localized in their neighborhood. If you think of elementary schools, usually serve a neighborhood or a small city. You can start there, or, even think, to larger issues. And so it really just depends on, what topic you're teaching, what they're learning about, what they're interested in. And it's I don't know any other way to put it other than it really depends. So
Well, I guess let's maybe start at when I think about being a citizen, like you know, let's leave off global for a second, and
Yeah.
we'll just talk about what it
Let's
means to
start
be
small. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, like and not even super small, but kind of national. Let's say like what it means to be a national citizen, and my idea of some of that comes from guys like Adam Smith or somebody else who is going to talk about our commitments to the state and the state's commitments to us. And so there seems to be an exchange there that, yes, we will pay taxes and follow your laws, and you will protect us from certain things.
Right.
Um, and I'm assuming that, I mean, my assumption is that most of my rights come from this. If I'm a good citizen, then I can follow these rights that are guaranteed.
Right. Yeah. And absolutely, if you think about it from that national perspective, you exist in a society. You are a part of those laws. Whether you want to be or not, there's certain things that are, you are expected to do. Now, does that mean you always follow them? No. For example, the speed limit sign. Like, I went 2 miles per hour over the speed limit on my way here.
Oh, no.
I know, but
turn yourself in.
Right. I know. Sorry. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely things that you give up when you are a part of a society in terms of individual freedom, and I know that's something you've talked about before on this podcast, and just that idea of, okay, yes, I'm going to trade my ability to drive however fast I want for both the ability to drive on roads that are paid for by the city or county governments, and then also so that way other people aren't just flying down, and we have that safe community, and in terms of I know that generally people are going to follow safety laws and everything else. So
yeah, so and of course that's always the contradiction, right? Is wanting your individual freedoms. You want the right to do whatever you want to do.
Yeah.
And then you have to balance that out with the safety of the populace.
Yeah.
And trying to find a happy medium between those two seems difficult. I think that when we talk about safety, it changes a lot of things. But when we start talking about how markets work or what people desire and desire fulfillment, then it really does start switching up kind of how we see ourselves and what we want to do. And this would become maybe the part where you go from national citizen into something else, is when you decide maybe you're going to go to a different country because they have different laws.
Right. Or even, if there's things that you want to buy from another country, or if you just want to travel there, it starts to definitely, I mean, how many people have we seen online posts about moving to a different country if so-and-so wins the election, or different things like that. And, and some people do it. There were a couple really famous examples of people that left post 2016 that I can think of. But it usually doesn't happen. Usually most people are kind of where they're at because it takes an enormous amount of resources to uproot and move yourself out of the country.
Yeah, and then there's always the grass looks greener because they have one thing that you're looking forward to, right? Which may not be the current president. And maybe if that, it's interesting when you move based off of a negativity rather than a positivity.
Right.
But if there was a positive change you're moving into, then it tends to also be that there's negatives within that society that you just maybe haven't seen yet.
Yeah.
Or you've decided you're willing to live with those. They're the lesser evil.
Yeah, exactly. And it's any country you go to is going to have its issues that, like you said, it almost takes living there and being a part of that community to really understand those issues. Because if you're from the outside looking in, you're never going to really know. And even I think when you do move there, you're still it's going to take you a while to at least feel part of that community and to have others see you as being a part of that community too.
Yeah, if ever.
I mean, this is my 7th year in Texas, and I still feel like an outsider sometimes. So.
I guess I've been here since high school, so I've kind of I've moved in okay, but occasionally you still see something and your brain shorts out for a second.
Yeah, absolutely. And other people will never see you as being fully Texan. So
right. Which, in other parts of the US, that's a great thing to not be Texan.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
Once again, it depends on your locality and your context.
Yeah, exactly. And and actually that brings up a really interesting point, because Texas, with its history, wasn't always a part of the United States. It was, obviously indigenous land first, and then, Spaniards settled it and there's the history we learn about that is very misleading and doesn't actually address any of the issues that went along with, well, what does it mean to actually take land from people who were living here? If you look at the history of the missions, if you ever travel there, they tend to gloss over that fact. But so you had indigenous citizens living in Texas from various different nations, and then you had Spanish settlers come in, and then you had people from the United States come in, and then it was independent, and then now it is a part of the United States, and so and of course was part of Mexico as well. I'm sure I jumbled that whole timeline up, but I never took Texas history, so forgive me on that one. But for any Texas history people out there, but if you think about, people have been in Texas, their families have been here longer than it's been a part of the United States. Obviously there's people I'm sure who are indigenous who've been here even longer than it was a part of any European country or settlement or anything like that. So,
and then part of the thing about this is that everything is in flux. I think that if we look at this on a timeline, we're putting in dots on this timeline, and what we're talking about is constant change over time.
Right.
And so what it means to be a Texan now is different than what it meant to be a Texan previously.
Right.
And as we continue moving forward, those changes I think will keep occurring, but we're also in this, and I'm just going to go ahead and jump into this side of it that's fussy, that we have to wonder sometimes, yes, we live in a nation, but that nation, like some of the biggest entities in it are national. Mm-hmm. So when you get into things like Amazon or Google or some of these larger corporations, and you start thinking, maybe we're actually living in a system of corporate nations, right?
Yeah.
And that the government itself is actually at the whim of these corporations. For instance, what was it? Apple recently moved their headquarters to Ireland, I think. Did you read that?
I missed that one. Yeah.
Yeah, it was to skip taxes, right?
Yeah.
So they no longer have to pay, I don't know how many trillions of dollars in taxes they owe to America because their headquarters is a small building in Ireland, yet they continue to operate out of America.
Yeah.
So you run into these things where all of a sudden you could be part of and this is kind of the Margaret Atwood, her Mad Adams series talks a lot about these huge corporations that set up gated communities. You live, work, breathe, do everything within them. They recruit from the outside, bring you into these utopian worlds, and everything else just falls apart.
Yeah.
You don't care about states, you don't care about nations, anything else. It's all just these corporations that run you. And so there is this tendency whenever global free market, neoliberal capitalism, blah, 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 whenever this spreads.
Giroux, are you listening?
Yeah, right. Whenever all of this spreads to a certain point, you just start thinking like maybe, alignment with a corporation has more security and safety in it than alignment with a nation.
Right. Well, especially if you work there, because that's where your paycheck comes from, and that's how you support yourself. And I'm sure if you live in a gated community, like for example, I'm thinking of this is obviously a satirical example, but the opening episode to Silicon Valley, Mike Judge's show, that opening episode where it basically Hooli is obviously the fictional company that they all work at, but they have shuttles that pick their employees up from their houses and take them to work. And when they're there, all their meals are taken care of. They don't ever have to leave. It looks like this, wonderful utopia. And then you start to really peel it back and get that critical look. And that I highly recommend that whole series for just kind of making fun of the tech industry. Especially when it came out at a time before that was really a big thing that people were doing.
Mike Judge has had a way of finding these things 10 to 20 years before they become sort of common knowledge or popular, and sort of bringing them into shows like Idiocracy, right? Or even Beavis and Butthead.
Okay, Beavis and Butthead, classic.
Right. Office Space. So these kind of things where you point out something that is a facet of life now that maybe we are just stuck in.
Yeah.
And you don't really think about it all that much. And it seems to have all the beautiful trappings that we want. But maybe there's some dark underbelly to it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, also getting back to what you were talking about the multinational corporation and how they set up operations in different places. I was thinking about this today while thinking about what I was going to talk about. And one of the things I thought about was the car I drive it's a Honda, but it was manufactured. So it's a Japanese car company, but they manufactured it in Ohio. But I bought it in Texas, and before it was in Texas, it came from California. So if you think about those various, different entities, and then all the American companies that are operating and manufacturing stuff overseas as well, it is very much a corporate world instead of a nation state world that we're living in.
And then who is that working for whenever we're in this kind of framework where we have multiple nations involved? And I'm assuming, my first assumption is it works pretty well for the consumer due to lower costs.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you can afford the products that are being made. So it works for consumers and who it's being made for. It works for, I would assume, the people making hundreds of billions of dollars. Jeff Bezos, we're talking about you, or even the Jobs family with Apple, or anyone who kind of were a part of that, or you just name the company and there's lots of money to be made there if they're a large multinational corporation. And so it works for them. But one of the things that I think we really need to start considering and thinking about and centering, not just thinking about, but actually centering, are the people who are actively harmed by these policies. If you offshore the manufacturing of clothes and you take that factory to Bangladesh, what are those factory workers' lives like? And it turns out not very good. There's a really good Planet Money video podcast series where they make a t-shirt. And to me, the most powerful part of that, it walks through how it goes from cotton to a finished t-shirt. But the most powerful segment was where they interviewed garment workers, and they interviewed two different workers and how subtle shifts in comparing them. One person was in Colombia, I believe, and she worked at the garment factory, but was also starting a business and had some vision of social mobility. But the Bangladeshi garment worker that they interviewed was essentially entrapped and working in this factory, and it was really sad. Definitely changed my perspective, and I think really we need to center those perspectives when we talk about and think about global citizenship, or globalization in this case.
Wasn't when you're talking about that, it reminded me of, I think Marx talks about this separation from the consumer not seeing the means of production, right? And this separation ends up creating this kind of gap where we don't know what goes into things. We actually think wood comes from Home Depot, right? And we don't understand the processing of it, or we think the fabric comes from the mall, the stores that you go to, without actually seeing or even having to think about the other things. So those things become invisible over time, and this seems to be intentional.
I mean, if we saw how plastic was manufactured, for example, that everything kind of comes packaged in, we probably would never, and all the pollution that comes about as a result of that, even if we happen to recycle plastic, there's a lot of pollution that comes about from that. And so even something, when we're so far removed, we can take one piece and zoom in on it, and it's like this really harmful thing. I think that it part of capitalist beliefs is that consumers have perfect information. Well, we definitely don't have perfect information, right? We don't know the true cost of what we're buying. We don't understand that, and on purpose.
On purpose. And then not only that, but would we want to? That becomes the other thing, is that there's this play between our desires to own that $25 pair of shoes that, if we were to build it ourselves, like as craftsmen, and there's several books and things that have gone through this process. There's one book by an economist that just goes through the path of a pencil. There's an artist who tried to make a toaster by himself, and the idea would cost like $30,000 to make a toaster yourself. Like you had to go mine the oil products, and you had to pull this out, and then you had to cast it and mold it and all these things, make the filaments yourself and do everything from scratch. Like, what does that actually cost? And then we really start getting into this specialization of each person, each company, each culture. Like each nation seems to offer something a little bit different. Maybe cheap labor, maybe access to rare minerals.
And that can be really good if what we're doing is helpful for people. in general, and that's not to say everyone necessarily needs to make $85 an hour, or the wage debate is a huge issue, and I think when people do specialize, they should be compensated fairly for that. Oftentimes people are not in a position to be able to negotiate their salaries, and so it keeps them trapped in below market rates, and if we want to look at it from a neoliberal perspective. But it's and so I'm trying, I guess the biggest thing is that exchange of goods and ideas and labor and putting things together and resources can be very beneficial. Obviously, it gives us the toaster, it gives us our cars. It's helped us tremendously, but I think we're kind of entering that phase in our existence where we need to really think about, well, yes, we've been able to do all these things, but hey, should we have done all these things? That whole Jurassic Park, you never started to consider whether we should build roads and cars, and what neighborhoods are we going to destroy in that process, and different things like that, and what kind of harm are we going to cause the earth. And we really need to, I think, start considering that. And this idea that all of these things are intractable, I don't personally buy, because we designed everything that we're in right now. If we wanted to center ethical consumption of products, if we wanted to center ethical manufacturing products, or rewarding people for their skills, we could. Yes, things would cost more, but everyone, to me, is a cheap t-shirt worth, subjugating someone else in a distant country to, extreme poverty? No.
Yeah.
So I only need a few t-shirts.
Right. Or, and this is, I think it's a kind of utilitarian thought experiment, but there's this idea of happiness, right? And there's this idea that utilitarianism, and you're trying to produce the most good for the most people, or the most happiness for the most people. And that is a fluctuating cycle whenever you get outside the local, because one of the Peter Singer things is, of course, if you see a kid drowning and you're wearing $100 pair of shoes, you're going to jump in and save the kid drowning, because
maybe
right. Because in theory most people would jump in, because the shoes are not worth the price of it's the hypothetical,
right?
The child's life is much more valuable.
Right.
And then they just go, okay, well, let's get rid of geography. What if this kid is in Africa? Will you send them $10 to save their life with a mosquito net?
Right.
And most people are like, right?
Yeah.
And so
remove that immediacy.
Remove the locality and the geography, and all of a sudden the context switches, and all of a sudden that $100 is worth, spending on a pair of shoes. And so there's this kind of changeover. But when they were talking about happiness and these kind of things, there's this crazy analogy, and I can't remember who came up with it, but if you had a city and it was fueled by, everyone is, say, a 90% happiness level. But what it took to keep everyone at 90% happiness was one child to be tortured every day. And they put this child in a basement, and this child suffers day after day. But that's what it took to make sure everyone else was 90% happy. Would you still be willing to live in that community?
Mm-hmm.
And this is just one of these thought experiments that you just go, what is your happiness worth? Right? There's all these books about happiness hypothesis, and happiness is this metric, and everyone talks about happiness all the time.
Yeah.
And then we also have to look at what is causing most of our happiness seems to be consumption, right?
Yeah.
Desire and consumption, desire fulfillment with consumption. And you wonder, if you got rid of those, if there might be a different metric that we could use to actually maintain happiness.
Right. And that's a good point. Or even what does consumption actually drive our happiness, or have we retrained ourselves to derive happiness from consumption? And like, oh, I got this new toy, I got this new t-shirt, which yours is way nicer than mine, by the way. The idea,
the waking up app. Okay. This is so this is my meditation shirt.
Oh, nice. Okay. Yeah, there we go. So that's why the light is off.
It's off and upside down.
Pure thinking. Yeah. So yeah, it definitely brings to the forefront of my mind at this moment, thinking about, well, what really makes us happy. And yes, going out to eat and eating a delicious meal does make me happy in the moment, but is it long-term happiness? Maybe in some cases, if you have that, if you go to, Jiro Sushi restaurant in Japan and have that's probably something you would remember and be really happy about for the rest of your life. But, if you go to, Applebee's, I don't know, you know what I mean? Like, it's fun and it's okay, I guess. I haven't been in a long time, but it's, how happy are you with that? And so, long term. And I don't know, at what point do we have to really stop and think about, and not just think about, but then how do we turn our thoughts into actions, and how do we change systems? Because we individually can do all we want, but if Amazon and Apple and Google are continuing these practices that are really harmful, they're that's not going to do too much. So
Yeah, that's one of the things I was kind of thinking as well, is I wonder if, and there is a tendency to quite often offload the responsibility from the citizens.
Yeah.
Let's blame it on the way that marketing has messed with us, right?
Yeah.
So marketing did this to us, and then the other one is no, production did this to us.
Yeah.
But it was all done to the citizen.
Yeah.
And there's this other idea that maybe the citizen has their own voice and can take action in some way.
Yeah.
So how do you see that shaping out?
Well, I think first we have to really think about, we have to go back to our first question and think about, well, what is a citizen? Like, what does that mean to be a citizen? And really, if you strip away the nationality, if you strip away really it just means to be. It means to be a person and to exist. Everyone is a citizen, and in my opinion, I should say. And I'm just kind of thinking about this, and I'm sure other people have wrote about it much more eloquently and better than this, but the idea that, well, you're not a citizen until you're 18 and can vote. You're not a citizen until this. It really becomes difficult. And from a teaching perspective, when I'm teaching someone who maybe has, just moved to the United States, who's not a citizen, but we're talking about citizenship, are they not a citizen? Well, no, they're a citizen. Like, they're a part of our community and our class and everything else. And so I think that, that idea kind of we have to address that first. And then when you were talking about that, and I'll need you to repeat your question, but I'll just say this first. I was thinking about Charlie Chaplin in Modern Times and the factory scene, and how he is essentially just like constantly like, riveting the bolts or whatever, and sneezes and has to go back and get caught up. And all he does is, turn those rivets, and he goes, obviously goes into the machine, and, he turns into, everything he does is a riveter. He's a riveting assemblage, so to speak, if we want to. It's so. What's his life like? That's all. That was it for a while until he finally snapped and destroyed the factory and everything else. So.
Well, and I think that's the classic thing that we're talking about too, right? Is if you can center this around humans, but whenever you try to turn the human into an efficient machine, at that point you're commodifying the human, right? And so Taylorism really did a lot of workplace practices in the factories that made sure that everything was about efficiency. So efficiency became the primary gauge by which you did everything, and thus humans had to become as efficient as machines.
Right.
And the interesting thing is you may be able to do that for a while, but what are the costs?
Yeah.
And if you take the idea that if you do anything for 8 to 10 to 12 hours a day, what are you going to take home with you? What happens to your mind then, right? Yeah. And there's this idea that you can only know a human in their off hours.
Right.
So who do you become after spending 10 to 12 hours a day behaving like a machine, becoming commodified? Do you go out and equally commodify everything else?
Right.
Or do you turn on the animal side, right? Because you had to suppress it for so long that then you turn back into your evolutionary behaviors.
Yeah, that question is a little bit above my pay grade, but
I don't know either.
But I do think that I was thinking, earlier today, scrolling through Twitter as one does, and I came across a tweet by Dr. Ruha Benjamin, who wrote a book that I love and has been is just really incredible, called Race After Technology, that I recommend everyone go buy and read, and she tweeted about she was repeating an account of an Amazon warehouse worker in Bessemer, Alabama, and they are currently deciding whether to unionize at that Amazon warehouse. And if it does, it could have potential ripple effects throughout the whole company. And getting to your point where they track your movements, they track how efficient you are, treating you like a machine. And then there's obviously issues where people aren't able to use the restroom because it counts against them. And you think about, well, what does that mean for, who can, navigate those situations and everything else, and what costs or, how difficult that is. And at that point you aren't human and you are being treated like a machine. And while certain people might think humans are just computers and machines that can do whatever, there's other things to us that make us be. And, that's kind of what life is, whether it's in humans. And I think personally animals have that as well. There's things about us that don't make sense. There's things about us that go beyond that machine-like environment where we're just, riveting bolts there's more to it than that. And I think that, not to get too philosophical on this philosophy podcast, but it does, you talk about that, brought that to my mind, and I wanted to highlight that and everything else. It's very interesting. So.
Yeah, I think this is the other side of this, is privileging humans, right? Yeah. I think there seems to be a pendulum swing where we're trying to return back to what humans are. And maybe that's because we do live in such a utopian environment, right? That we're not scraping by for survival.
True, yeah.
So we have this sort of privilege to be able to look around and say, can we be humans again?
Yeah.
And to be able to make decisions that have long-term, large, maybe potentially large ripple effects that can go outwards, where no, we are as a society no longer going to endorse sweatshop slavery, so to speak, or serfdom, whatever you want to call it, where people get trapped within these vicious cycles. And then one of the things that's really funny is if we privilege intelligence, most of these sweatshops are also taking the intelligent people out. Like Richard Sennett talks a little bit about how in a work pool, then say the best auto mechanics are having a hard time surviving because that's just sort of paycheck to paycheck, and so they can't get a loan. So they need to go work at the auto factory. The auto factory has brain deadening behavior, as they were calling it. And so you end up taking the most talented people in a region and putting them into brain deadening factory labor because it's the only way they can get a loan from the bank. Yeah. So you have these systems that are set up, and each one of these systems sucks in talent as well as cheap labor, and that actually never allows these really intelligent people to actually participate in creative endeavors or attentive endeavors.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah, I had never even really considered that, but yeah.
Yeah, it's just one of those ripple effects that once you set up a financial system that operates a certain way and rewards certain things, and then for survival and security, then we end up having to make compromises.
Yeah.
And this would be, I guess, that kind of basic idea that we want to set up a sort of survival base so that everyone can at least survive.
Yeah.
And then we can go on top of that. But when your survival is in question, it's really hard to make decisions that have any kind of ethics to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is a really good point. It's if you're just surviving, obviously that's going to be your number one focus. So, but like you were mentioning, for a lot of people that we have the time, like I personally have the time to consider these things and think about these things. And you were talking about the centering of what it means to be human, and I think part of citizenship needs to also be extended into what does it mean for animals to exist? The way that we treat animals around the world. Essentially in some cases, if whole animals exist purely to end up as food for us to consume. And then the way they're treated along that process is not humane, which that has been well documented in a lot of other areas and spaces. And so, thinking about how, and I'm not saying, because I still personally eat meat and I'm trying to eat less of it. And that's a whole, back and forth thing I'm thinking about and trying to come to terms with. But really, so I'm not, judging anyone for eating meat or saying we shouldn't, but it is something to consider and think about. And again, beyond just thinking about, we don't want to just say thoughts and prayers for the animals, but what can we do as citizens, as humans that are currently centered to make animal life better to where they don't just exist purely for consumption? And what does that mean for us when we live? Probably less meat options available at certain prices, but
yeah, and this is back to that sort of consumptive tendency.
Yeah.
And I mean, there is a phrase out there that, what's done to the least of us is done to all of us,
Yeah.
right? That it basically shapes your soul. And that goes back to that story of that town with the small child. And if you had to
Right.
torture the town to be happy, torture the child for the town to be happy, then, you have options to leave, to move
Yeah.
that town, or you have options to fight back against that system. So what kind of steps do you think are possible for us to start taking?
So I think it definitely has to be, we have to start looking at what we can do to change the systems of power that we have. So thinking about obviously it starts with elections, right? In our cases, because our government does have immense power to set policies and standards and different things, how businesses operate, even if sometimes they like to pretend like they don't. And like, oh, well, who could ever stop Google from stealing faces, and who could stop them from designing racist facial recognition technology? And well, you can say this is illegal, and you can find them heavily to the point where it doesn't make financial sense for them to do these things.
Yes.
There's options, but so I think definitely collectively pressuring our government and other governments to decenter these harmful policies, and to again put humans and animals first. I think that's kind of one of the first steps we can take. And then more broadly, as we start our businesses, because humans all even Amazon was started by a person. If we are starting businesses, if we are operating, if we're kind of going through our lives really thinking about what we are doing and what that really means, I think is an important step. And then how can we talk about this and spread this to other people too? And it's obviously I don't think it's really hard to convince someone of your opinion, especially if they don't want to hear it. But I do think that there's times where we can talk about stuff in real life, or online as well, where we can share these ideas and have actual conversations and think about these things. And because I think a lot of these issues, if you talk to most people would agree, yeah, we shouldn't treat animals the way that they're treated, for if they're living in these inhumane conditions. I think there's definitely areas where people can understand each other, because I think we all kind of understand what it means to be alive and exist. And so I would say those are some good starting points. And then also really thinking about who is centered in our policies, and just kind of taking a step back and seeing the broader picture, and thinking, realizing that A, we're here temporarily, and B, that for a lot of us, our existence and our state of life is not 100% due to our own successes and like our own willpower, right? We benefit from a lot of societal things that are in place, whether that's as a white male, is being white and male in America has certain privileges and certain things I don't have to worry about. And so really thinking about, well, how does society work for me, but how does it not work for others, and how can we work to correct for that injustice?
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, a lot of us are quite lucky.
Yeah.
And I was reading about luck egalitarianism the other day, and just this idea that we are tremendous. Some of us are tremendously lucky,
right,
and other people aren't as lucky. And what's also fascinating is when you take that into a global context.
Yeah.
Even sometimes the most unlucky people in America are much more lucky than people in other countries.
Right.
And yet there's this tendency to forget that, because we're only seeing local circumstances.
Yeah.
And so figuring out how to sort of keep a global perspective seems difficult. I mean, is there anything that you do to sort of maintain a larger perspective?
I definitely, right now it's hard, because we're all kind of separated out and isolated from everything. But I do try and not only listen and learn from other people, but try and really incorporate their work into what I do. For example, I mentioned Dr. Ruha Benjamin earlier. Her book Race Against Technology has impacted how I see both how some of the things I've researched in terms of how we as teachers use technology that is coded with racial biases, but then also think about, okay, so students, what does this mean for them if they're being surveilled, right? What does this mean for the technology we use in our class? So I don't use any in my classes. They have certain technology that allows you to see what students are doing on their computers. I don't use that because it I think that it's very Foucauldian, and I don't want to be on the other side of that mirror looking at, like, it feels weird. It's very panoptical, and I don't want to be in the middle of the panopticon ever. That's generally a rule in life. Like, try not to be in the middle of the panopticon.
Yeah, no, I used to just tell people, it's like, I didn't get this job to be a cop.
Yeah.
I'm your teacher.
Right.
I'm not, my job is not to police you.
Right. But that is, I think, it's sort of become a default stance of a lot of educators where, and they're doing it to, try and prevent cheating, and academic, plagiarism and different things like that. And I get it. I guess my thing is, well, how could we redesign schooling, especially right now where everyone's in different spaces? And that's another thing. What does that mean as a white male teacher to be surveilling students if they're using a lockdown browser like Proctero or some of these companies that will track your face and watch your room behind you to see if anyone comes in, or your eye movements? What does that mean to be looking in on my students' personal spaces? It's really a very I don't think it's really been thought through from an ethics perspective and from a privacy perspective and a constitutional perspective. Like, what space is yours? What right to privacy do you have? And so rather than saying, well, we have to make sure they're not cheating on this multiple choice test, well, how else could we assess student learning? What does it mean to learn something, first of all? Is it answering a multiple choice question? I think most educators would probably say, well, I mean, it can tell you a little bit, but it's not the best way to assess something. So that's one thing that I've really thought about is, this technology is here. We can use it, but should we? That sort of techno-ethical perspective in my that's something that I've learned a lot from my doctoral advisor, Dr. Dan Krupka, who has written a lot about techno-ethics in education and sort of thinking about that. So it is it's pretty wild to think about what we're able to do as teachers, and what kind of information we have, and also what kind of information schools are expected to follow to maintain for discipline policies and things like that.
That's one of the other parts of this, is a lot of this seems to be, the pressure seems to be coming down, right? There's a legacy of testing that has been proven to be racially biased, and there's all these kind of ways that they're looking for something in a student, right? And this idea that we're somehow mining our population for potential, and then we will lift those people up and everyone else gets left behind.
Right.
And then they go, no child left behind. And then anyone who's been a teacher is like, have you ever been in a classroom?
Right.
Like, do you see how this functions?
Yeah. And especially when they change how those tests are scored to where it's on the bell curve. So they say, okay, well, what are our scores? Okay, well, then this is the passing rate. So the goal of No Child Left Behind was every student's going to be proficient at these things by 2009. Well, if we change what proficient is, you're never going to get everyone to what was proficient in 2001. And so and that's one of those things that personally never made sense to me. Growing up in that system, and then now as a teacher looking back and seeing how that works. And it's just, that's one of the things I don't understand about statistics from an education perspective. And I have friends who are very into statistics and educational statistics who, and I commend them for learning it and understanding it. That's just one of the things that never really made sense to me on a personal level.
Nope. That's so this is also one of those things that we know there's intelligent people out there. There's smart people that are coming up with interesting ways to do all sorts of things. When it comes to something like citizenship or global citizenship, or promoting and centering humans and animals and some sort of cruelty-free world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, where are these smart people on those topics, right? What is the next step there? I keep thinking about whether or not they're working in government, why they're not in government. Maybe they
Right.
are. And then I also think about the smart people being sucked into things like Google,
Yeah.
right? Because of the salary.
Right. Or Facebook. Or
Facebook, yeah.
yeah, I would. So there are a lot of smart people, I think, in traditional academic spaces, but that space is getting more and more marginalized due to budget cuts and other things in the United States, at least. I've personally, the United Nations with their UNESCO issues, and from an education perspective, they have the Education for Sustainable Development and other various things. I think they're doing a lot of interesting work, although again a little flawed because it does tend to center the neoliberal market perspective of, yes, we have to sustainably develop so we can continue to consume all of these things, but sustainably. And so it's not really thinking about that. But there's, as far as specific people in that space, there are a lot of really great people out there. I can't think of them right now.
No, no. Yeah, I think maybe what we'll do is throw some links on the website when we're through, just various things we've read or heard. And I think there is a general idea that, at least for me, one of the ways I think about is things is generational.
Yeah.
Is that if the younger generation has certain access to things and they find certain values in some things and not other things.
Right.
And some of this might be social capital. I'm kind of interested in how social capital tends to work in different areas.
Yeah.
And I think this, of course, comes from reading about capitalism and what it does to individuals and how it strips away certain parts of their identity. It strips apart their history. So you have to be flexible all the time. You have to deal in abstractions all the time.
Right.
And so we end up de-championing and disenfranchising anyone that does something like works with their hands.
Yeah.
And so we end up having these hierarchies and social strata that become formed. And I'm sort of interested in how that can also be reversed. Right. And of course, I'm thinking of school as the place to start for something like this.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and unfortunately, schools have gotten into the neoliberal mindset of we have, and I'm thinking of there are any number of schools in this area that have 2, 3, 4,000 students in them, and does that actually work from the perspective of, yes, it works, like, the students are the things that they're able to do in schools now in terms of there's, at the school I teach at, there's robotics classes, there's, all sorts of, STEM, that there's agricultural classes, there's, lots of opportunities for students to learn things, health sciences, being EMT techs and everything else that were not around when I was in high school that are really interesting and cool. But I think that largely the idea that we can educate, hundreds of thousands of people in the exact same way, thinking broadly of, okay, everyone's going to take these tests, these standardized tests. I think that we need to really take a step back and not do. I personally don't think we should administer those tests with the stakes that they have.
So that's being a riveter again, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because that's what it's like. Okay, well, do you understand this small, tiny facet of U.S. history? This is also from the white male perspective. Mm-hmm. Do you know about these tiny little details that don't really mean anything when it comes to citizenship or kind of understanding what it means to exist in the United States? We learn the history, kind of, sort of one tiny version of it. But we don't actually step back and think, well, what does this mean? Yes, this is the history, but what does that mean for me right now? What does that mean for people in the past? And that was one of the things that I think, not only Howard Zinn wrote about in the People's History of the United States, but then there have been 5 follow-up books that are kind of in that same vein, from the People's History of the United States to, I think there's a queer history of the United States, an indigenous history of the United States, black woman's history of the United States, and so on, and we will definitely link those in the show notes, because it sort of can show, okay, this is what people were experiencing, these people were experiencing at that point in history. And I think that those ideas, while not easily quantifiable or ending up on a standardized test, can help students understand that, what their society is like, and kind of see, okay, this is kind of the same in this way, this is different in this way, and you sort of see, okay, well, this is what people did then, well, this is what we can do now. And so that, one of the best things about being a teacher is seeing, the activist work that students of mine have gone on to do. And I am in no way taking credit for it at all. The work that they do is really interesting. I've had students, lead and organize March for Our Lives marches against gun violence. I have a student who has done work bringing to light issues of genocide in the Middle East. And it's just really cool to and again, talking with people who have experienced those issues and bringing that to other people like me who would never have heard their stories or anything like that. So that's, the ideas are there, the foundation is there. For this, it's just kind of rethinking what we do with our time, because the other thing with standardized tests too that people don't often consider is the amount of time it takes to give it, not just to give the test, but the review time. You review 3-4 weeks before the test. You take the test, and after the test, you need a week to decompress before you can pick back up with stuff. Because it is exhausting, and the stress on students, on teachers, because of the stakes on the test. Again, it's not necessarily the tests themselves, it's the stakes. It's the ratings that come along with it, the funding that used to come along with it, that can really make it a lot of pressure and stress. And I think that really, I did the math once, if we eliminated that, it's something like 15% of the school year is spent on those tests, and that's a lot of time. I mean, and if you think about, especially in a history class, you learn the history to then be able to do something with it at the end, but then you take away all that time to do something with it. It's there's no easy answer, but I think that the first thing we could do is to step back from the stakes and step back from the tests, and maybe we actually give tests for certain data points and know what they're good for, but not solely rely upon them for ratings.
Yeah, I guess I've read 2 different books that the authors specifically point out problems with testing.
Yeah.
And they really jump on it as, once again, this thing that infiltrates our entire society and sets up winners and losers. Yeah. And it sets up a lot of other problems that cause contentions for people, that it basically says you as an individual are not good enough.
Right.
And then people have to find something else they're good at, right?
Yeah.
And so there's this kind of inherent problem with searching for the thing that you're good at, so that you then know who you are and how you can make it in society. Right. So this idea of inherently just being an individual, having value, it really ceases to work whenever we're commodifying people. When we're looking for talent, when we're searching for potential, when we're searching for ability, then it sort of breaks down how we're supposed to just have good people, right? Because you're not just a good person, you're only good for your function.
Yeah.
And so that goes back to that factory mindset, and of course commodification of the individual, of the self, right?
Yeah.
And self-streamlining, so that you modify yourself to be good at these tests.
Right.
You modify yourself to just work on process-based questions,
mm-hmm.
and to articulate certain things, and then forget the information 2 weeks later because you don't need it anymore.
Right.
You just train yourself for temporary, momentary tasks. And what does it actually look like when you're a 40-year-old person?
Yeah.
Right? What kind of individual are you? What kind of relationships do you have? What kind of long-term goals do you have in your life? Well, maybe they're all just short-term, and you're just running on momentum. So these become some of these sort of philosophical, or not even philosophical, sociological and ethnographic kind of problems that we're going to continue to run into when our society is based around these things. Of course, on the other side, we can look back into the past, and we can see varying and negative consequences from having super community-centered groups.
Right.
Because there's in and out groups, and there's hierarchies, and people are really, really good at gauging each other and setting up systems in which you're in and you're out.
Right.
As sort of a hierarchical ape-based species, it's what we're the best at.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, all these kind of things with statistics and logic, apparently we have trouble with.
Yeah.
We have trouble employing them over the long term. We don't understand exponential rises, only linearity.
Right.
There's all these kind of problems that are built into us neurologically that I wish we could set up counters for. I keep thinking that wouldn't it be great if schools taught meditation?
Yeah, and that would be immensely beneficial. I mean, as a teacher, that would be beneficial for me to have time, and I have I have lunch, I have a conference period, and I have my space to decompress, but it would be beneficial for students, to have that time for decompression, kind of think about what they've been learning about all day, and then come back refreshed and ready to go. And it is a skill. How do you meditate? Most people aren't Ron Swanson. They can't just sit there and just think about nothing for an hour and a half straight on their first try.
That man's got a gift.
He does. Yeah. He does. Speaking of working with your hands, making canoes and everything.
Yeah, totally being a libertarian and
yeah. But it's things like that, and it gets back to the point of what is knowledge, like why have we chosen these subjects, and I'm kind of now thinking back to social studies as a subject when it was founded in 1913, and it was like theorized and written down and founded, and a bunch of white men got together and wrote about it. And at that time, if you were a woman, you legally couldn't vote. If you were a black male, you probably, almost probably couldn't vote, depending upon, the cities. Like the voting percentage of black men had gone down dramatically from the Reconstruction era in the United States. And yet we're starting a subject whose core value is citizenship. And one of the first subjects that was kind of the capstone, if you will, of social studies was called Problems of Democracy, where students would identify problems in society, in the United States society, and work to address those problems. And that has kind of fallen by the wayside in favor of U.S. government or civics or economics or different things in more modern times. But this idea that, we're starting this subject about citizenship where, we've really limited who can vote in this country. So yes, people are citizens, but if you don't have that right to vote, your social power is much less than other people. And so what did that mean for teachers of social studies in 1913? What did that mean for, black teachers teaching black students? What did that mean for, different things? And sort of that idea of how different groups have worked for different power in society and what that power looked like is really interesting. And, it's just that idea of what it means to, when you start a subject like that, like from its beginning, it's had issues, right? And I don't think we've fully addressed that in most schools. What we teach and what the standards are in Texas is racially biased. What and that impacts the textbooks. And there have been I had just watched recently The Revisionaries, which is a documentary about how standards are written in Texas, and you realize that those that process is extremely flawed.
I have a friend who I think helped make that movie.
Okay, yeah, it came out of someone did it for a grad school thing.
I think it was Scott Thurman is my buddy who was working, and it was either that one or one that was very similar to that.
Okay.
But yeah, it's also fascinating to sort of see how religion, right, ideology shapes these things,
right?
And so there's a lot of kind of complications that are inherent in them. And of course, as we sort of deconstruct things and pull them apart, there's only so much you can stuff back into a kid's head. Right. So we can't maybe share with them all the histories all at once.
Right.
But the idea that we are offering these broader glimpses.
Exactly.
And we're telling them through individual, more personalized narratives, it should have an impact.
Right. And we should have the freedom as teachers to, in just ways, be able to, because that's the other thing too, is that if you just say, okay, everyone has the freedom to teach whatever, you could have a teacher that is, a white supremacist who teaches those things to their students, and if there's no accountability there. But I think that, that more broadly, I think that we need to do a better job when teaching future teachers, how to teach about centering. And I'm definitely not the first person to say this. And within the social studies, I mean, Dr. Gloria Ladson Billings and with her work on culturally relevant pedagogy and culturally and critical race theory in education and everything else, and all of the incredible scholarship that's come out of that. Dr. Tyrone Howard, and many others that are escaping me at the moment. It's very interesting to think about. How can we make social studies, and in my case, and more broadly, education, more just in how we teach and how it's operated, is an important point to think about.
Oh no, it's a great point. Always just watching for the subalterns and really looking into how these things are built and developed, and it's really great talking to you about it, because on occasion I lose track of what's going on with the education system. It's really nice to hear that, of course, you're digging into this.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's there, and there are a lot of great people doing great work. But it's definitely at this point still an uphill climb to introduce, like you were mentioning, religion. That's another area where we could teach students about the world's religions and break that apart, and help them actually understand different beliefs and different things that people have. And it's complicated, it's difficult, nothing's easy, but it's, I think, worth it. I mean, if you're really thinking about it, you're talking about helping people understand themselves as humans and what it means to, going back to our initial question of citizenship and global citizenship, and what it means to exist as a human in your city, state, country, globe, is difficult, but really can help make your society better.
Thank you very much for sticking around and listening to that. I hope you enjoyed it. We will have another interview next week, and it's really kind of about humans as apes. It's a pretty fun conversation. It's a little bit shorter than this one. And also, of course, if you enjoy the show, please like, rate, do all those good things. And on the website, letusthinkaboutit.com, there's a place to contribute, $5 or $5 per month, whatever you feel like doing to help us out here. All right, many thanks. Bye-bye.